My name is Mark. This is Zen Talk, and we're going to be talking about asceticism. In Zen, the ascetic is often called the Zen Monk. This is a person that will take some vows. Generally, they will take the Bodhisattva precepts and they will make the Samanera vows, which is a vow of asceticism. The Bodhisattva precepts in Zen is a Mahayana concept. It is considered the highest ideal within the Mahayana Buddhism, and it is encouraged that all beings wishing to seek enlightenment in this lifetime follow the Bodhisattva path. Now, the Bodhisattva path is well laid out in the Mahayana Sutras, and we will be going over that in another video. Though generally we kind of mostly know of the Bodhisattva path through the precepts. And the precepts generally are to not kill, to not steal, to not engage in immoral or derogatory sexual activities. And as a Zen monk, or a renunciate, you would abstain from all sexual activities entirely. Not to use false words or speech, or encourage others to do so. To not trade or sell alcohol, or be used by them. To not talk about the misdeeds or faults of others. To not praise oneself, or speak ill will of others. To not be stingy, to not harbor anger, and to not speak ill of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, often called triple gems. So these are the Bodhisattva precepts, and these are derived from the Bodhisattva path, in which, like I said, it's a path of religious observation, servitude, morality, and of course being true to yourself and others. And it is considered the most expedient and the most direct path to enlightenment, thus Buddhahood. Alright, so the second vows that the Zen monk would take would be the Samanera vows. Now, you will see the first 5 of these vows is identical to the Bodhisattva vows, though the 6th vow is often the refrainment of taking food at the inappropriate times, generally afternoon. But more or less, if you really look at what it's saying, it's only eating at the times that food is offered, and not eating after those times. It also is about refraining yourself from entertainment, that of singing and dancing or playing music or attending performances. Refraining from beautifications of oneself. You're not to wear cosmetics or perfume, or decorative accessories, which this part down here, the decorative accessories within Zen sometimes is flagrantly ignored. Refraining from sitting on high chairs or sleeping on luxurious soft beds. Generally, what this is kind of saying is living like a king, or living in in such a way that is above the normal person. And lastly, it's the refraining from accepting money. And what this really is saying is that we are not beggars. We're not out there in the streets begging for money like a beggar would be. This is not who we are, and this is not what we are about. We're not about gaining money through showing how poor we are. So it is important at this time to understand that the Zen monk that commonly people will say they are, if you go to a Zen center, the teacher may say that they're a monk, or there may be somebody there that claims to be a monk. So we need to discuss seriously what has happened with the Zen monk and what happened in Japan. So this is a fact. This is not my opinion. This is not me just saying this. This is a well-documented fact, and anybody can read about this. So Japan ended the Zen monk in 1868 due to a series of events. And those series of events is called the Meiji Revolution. And in short, the history goes that the emperor wanted to revolutionize the Japanese culture. At that point in time, there was the samurai and the shogun were pretty much in charge, and they rejected all foreign intervention to the point of kicking out all foreigners. And they were intent to keep the Japanese society in a very agrarian, non-industrial culture in where they were in control. And that's what's going on. Well, the entire West was showing up on the shores of Japan with their ships, their modern weaponry, their modern ways, their modern clothing. And it was pretty much realized within the capital and more in the more progressive cities that if Japan didn't step up, it was going to be left well behind. So there was a push to modernize the Japanese culture and modeling it after Western Protestantism. And this is something that a lot of scholars will classify as the current way that the Western cultures were kind of working, which was a Protestant model of governance and religion. So there was a revolution in Japan. The samurai attempted to march on the capital city and take over, and they were defeated. Out of that defeat and suing for peace, certain things were changed. One was that the samurai were completely made illegal. You could not be a samurai anymore, and the shogun was completely out of power. Well, within that reforms, because the samurai and the Zen temples were sort of hand in hand, major reforms were made within the Zen temples. So one of the big forms was that Zen monks were no longer allowed to wear religious clothing. They were told they had to wear normal clothing. Zen monks were to marry and produce an heir. Zen monks were to eat meat. These were just a few of the examples. The emperor made Tendai the official religion. And when the emperor speaks, that's pretty much the end of all debates about what is what. So Tendai was the official religion in Japan, and they were only giving the bodhisattva vows. That's it. Here I say the samurai and shogun were disbanded, and foreigners were allowed in Japan. This was a big one here. So Japan quickly became a kind of emulating a lot of Western culture, and you can see a lot of photos of the early 1900s or late 1800s Japan, where Japanese are wearing Western clothing, looking very much like Englishmen, and that a lot of the buildings and a lot of the construction was modeling that of London. So the Tendai flourished, the Zen temples more or less just were either abandoned or they were more or less turned into residence for the monks and their families. Also, during the Meiji Revolution, there was a very anti-Buddhist purge. And sometimes in Zen lore and history, you will hear about the purge. One of the stories is about the silk monks, in where the monks would roll up the sutras in silk clothing and then hide them in their robes. And this was something that is kind of talked about within the Zen lore, and how the monks would escape into the mountainsides or the very remote parts of Japan to escape the persecution that was going on, because it was kind of considered that the Zen monks were kind of holding them back, that they were the problem. So there was a persecution. Many monks were killed. Many temples were burnt to the ground. Those that survived of the temples basically became residences for the monks and their families. And as time marches on, those temples basically became the properties of those families that remained there. And even today, if you wanted to be a priest in Japan, it's because your father is a priest. This is an inherited position. It's not something necessarily you go to the temple and you say, hey, I want to be a priest, sign me up, and by the way, where's my temple at? It doesn't work that way. You have to be born into it. And you'll find that this is extremely a tradition in the Pure Land sect of Japan, in where the Pure Land priests can only come from an inherited system from their father. So if your father's a priest, then you're going to be a priest, and that's just the way that is. All right, so that's what happened in Japan, and because of this reason, there really technically are no more Zen monks, and technically nobody who says they're a monk in the Zen system would be recognized as a monk. For example, in the countries of Korea, Vietnam, or most of South Asia, or what's left of Buddhism in China, would not recognize the Zen monk as a true Buddhist monk. They would recognize them just as an ascetic and as a bodhisattva. All right, so let's get to the point of what does it mean to live in a monastic setting. Now, I did live in a monastery for a year, and then prior to that, about 3-4 years in a Zen center, living as an ascetic. Now, the monastic life, what this really means is that you're joining an order of ascetics. These are fellow recluses who share the same goal and the same religion that you also are signing up for or currently hold. And it's sort of an agreement to live together on a property in an organized way as to help each other. And often this organized living of ascetics can be far more helpful in that you are sharing resources and that you are helping each other. And it's always said, for example, that cooking for 30 is far more efficient than just cooking for one. So in this particular idea, the Zen monastery is that of schedules and routines. Pretty much every moment of your day, there's a schedule and a routine about it. You don't have to ponder, what am I going to do next? It's pretty much there for you. You're living according to the samanera vows that you take, these vows of being a ascetic, a recluse. of these vows that you've taken, which is, in some countries, they would call these the vows of the junior monk or a novice monk, before taking the full vows of the Vinaya and becoming the true monk. So Samanera vows is you're not a monk, you're just an ascetic, you're just a recluse, you have renounced the world. You have a religious dedication, the Bodhisattva path, and this would be something that all of your fellow ascetics living in a Zen monastery would also be on the same path. Be no doubt about it. You have relinquished your worldly life. There's no TV, there's no movies, there's no music, and there's really no idle talk. There's really no big gossip sessions or anything like that. There may be discussions and there may be some sharing times or some, just general, let's talk about what you think the practice is, what you think things are going on here. And lastly, there's dedication to the Sangha. And this would be more of you're supporting each other in ways to help the Sangha, to help your fellow brothers and sisters become enlightened and actually walk the Bodhisattva path and help them with their vows. So cloistered living, which is what the monastic living would be, is not always possible. There are other ways, though, to live an ascetic life. So, when a cloistered monastic setting is not available or practical, and when I mean available is sometimes there's just nowhere to go, and that's just because of the culture, the place, the time, or practical. It's, if you have children, a husband, people that depend on you, or you have medical needs that would make living in a monastic setting either too burdensome for the other monastics or just not workable. There are other forms that are just as valid as living in a monastery, and you can certainly still take the ascetic vows and the bodhisattva vows and live as, quote, the Zen monk in these ways. Well, so one would be the hermit, which is you're simply living apart from society and where interactions with others is limited, if any at all. There are quite a few people who live as the hermit. These are, I see them sometimes. Sometimes they have home crafts and they live on properties that their family or they bought a long time ago. And a lot of times, the only time you really interact with them or see them is when they're down in the city to sell their wares and pick up supplies and haul themselves back into their little hermit caves, as we would call it. This could be a hut, this could be a house, it doesn't really matter. The next one is the recluse. And the recluse basically lives a very meager and modest life, maybe would only work enough to pay their bills and provide for their needs. They have limited social interactions and jobs where they work alone. And I have met quite a few Zen recluses. A lot of them work at home. They are tailors, authors. They do things in where they can earn just enough money to pay their bills and just enough money to provide for their needs, and that's it. The only time I really see them is when they came to the Zen Center to interact with the Sangha, to help out at certain functions. But even then, they very much limited themselves to just those functions. They did not engage in gossip. They did not talk about what was on TV or movies. They did not socialize in what I would call, normal means. They would speak when spoken to, but that was about it. And when he asked them what did they do, and they would almost always work alone, home crafts, and things where they did not have to interact with non-recluses. They try to avoid people who lived out in the world, because generally people who are worldly don't understand the recluse and tend to persecute them in the social settings and see them as weird and awkward. And lastly, a person can live the simple life. And this can be living with a spouse or perhaps with children. However, they avoid the popular culture like, TVs, movies, and sports theater events. They are encouraging to read, that of, more, not necessarily reading comic books or fiction, but, they read, they contemplate, and they have a strong devotion to helping the Sangha. And this may mean that, they're there to ensure that the Sangha buildings and the Sangha monks or the recluses that the Sangha has chosen to support have the support, and they are there to do a lot of things to ensure that the Sangha continues. All right, so let's just say you're like, okay, I just want to go do this. I want to be an ascetic, and I think it becomes pretty clear to most people who get into Zen for any period of time that the asceticism kind of is our way of life. We are not necessarily a group of people that are out in the world as it is to change the world. This is not who we are. We're not out there to change the culture, to change the politics, to change the the way that people are. We are a parallel society to offer those in that culture a different way of living. And that simply is because not everybody can live in the popular culture. And that just may be due to their own karma, their own past lives. Maybe they were a monk in a past life, and maybe they have have a degree of awakening already and realize that the popular life is just nothing but distractions and suffering. So let's say you're like, oh yeah, this asceticism definitely sounds like it's what you want. So here's some ideas. One would be to get rid of the clutter in your life, sell, give away, or just throw away unnecessary things. And you can look around, a lot of people can look around their lives and they realize, oh my goodness, the clutter is everywhere and it's distracting. Sometimes the clutter becomes their identity. Sometimes the clutter becomes their lives. It's often said that when you buy things, you don't own them, they own you. And this sometimes is something that you need to get rid of in order to be free of them, to be the ascetic, so that you're not becoming a slave to the things that you own. Reducing your entertainment intake. And I view today's entertainment more as indoctrination and brainwashing. Because a lot of the TV, the movies, and popular culture, internet, and games, they tend to promote an agenda and a view that I don't think is very helpful. It is often filled with immoralities and non-virtuous things. And honestly, this is not something that the recluse, the ascetic, is going to want to continue to intake, because it messes with your mind, it messes with your practice. So you reduce this. You devote your time to the Sangha, which is the membership, those that are also on the Bodhisattva path, and those that are also engaged in asceticism as well. You devote to the meditations, the meetings, and the helping and providing of others. And lastly, you probably want to find work that fits your ascetic lifestyle, working alone or working with other ascetics who truly get what you are doing. And I have worked in such settings where other craftsmen who are ascetics, there's no radio, there's no idle talk, there's no posters of girls on the walls. It's pretty much we'll go in and we'll do the work that we are needed to produce the goods that will be sold. And it's done in a very meditative, in a very pure fashion. All right, so some conclusions and some realities here. So asceticism is not easy. This is it's very difficult at first to walk the path of the asceticism, because you're constantly dealing with boredom. And that's mostly because your mind is conditioned to the worldly ways, and you got to go through a deprogramming detox of all these things. Your mind deprogramming can be painful, as the conditioning, often TVs and popular culture, is removed. You can experience a lot of anxiety issues that arise up due to the conditioned mind is in a panic. You've removed the conditioning that the mind has become accustomed to, so the mind panics. And this can also manifest itself in physical body pains and issues. I myself, during my own detox times, I went through a long period of stomach throwing up, stomach cramps. And I would literally throw up for hours. And I went to the hospital a few times, and it was, they're like, well, we think it's just some sort of anxiety panic disorder. Really, what it was the deprogramming, and my mind was in such convulsions. It's sort of like, if you are a heroin addict or some sort of drug user, and you stop using the drug, your body and your mind goes into a withdrawal panic, and you have issues, but you get over them. I've heard of other people having other kinds of physical manifestations of the anxiety issues when they stop watching TV and engaging in popular culture. But the benefits far outweigh the temporary anxiety, the issues, in where a calm and a clarity does eventually set in, and suddenly you get a glimpse of true practice. You get a glimpse of true Buddhism as it was meant to be. So another aspect of asceticism is we are not to become scholars or academics. This is not what asceticism is. We are not to become bookworms. One can. We read and study, but only for spiritual clarity, and for the clarity of our own practices, and for the clarity of what Buddha taught. And this is not to show off or believe that knowledge is enlightenment. And you'll see this often in the Zen centers, where people will show up and they will list off books that they have read and academics that they have listened to, and they will talk about what so-and-so thinks, and they will talk about all this knowledge that they know, because they believe that knowledge is enlightenment. They really, truly do. And this becomes so you're the ascetic who becomes the scholar who believes that knowledge is enlightenment, but they actually have no practice. And that becomes pretty apparent quickly, that they don't practice. They don't actually do what Buddha taught us to do. They study that. They're an expert on what Buddha taught, but they themselves don't actually put any of those teachings to use. So lastly, as an ascetic, I would say, you want to set a routine of service to the Sangha and contemplation and prayer. Now, a lot of people, and I've seen this in the comments on many forums, they're like, oh, contemplation, yes, that would be the meditations, the zazen's, the whatever you want to call it, and the prayer would be your aspirational devotions to the path. These two, oh yeah, they're down for that. But when it comes to the Sangha, there seems to be, at least from what I'm seeing people write on the internet, a lot of apprehension about the Sangha. They're like, I don't need that Sangha. I don't want to go there. And I would say that people who this is maybe more of an issue today, especially within the Western sanghas, and that might be because we're just haven't really developed a strong sangha, and that's because I would say that most people have a very weak practice. They have a very weak understanding of Buddhism. They have a very it's shallow, if not incomplete, knowledge of Buddhism, especially within Zen. The Zen tends to be more virtue signaling and kind of more of a thing that they're role playing with and not necessarily believe. There has not been a real practice that people have set with Zen. And if there is a practice, it's very weak. And so what ends up happening is, and why people kind of are very apprehensive about Sangha, is because the Sangha is weak. They're not defending other Sangha members. They're allowing non-Buddhist and non-Zen philosophies to enter the door. There's not much of a commitment to the Bodhisattva path, and there's really no real understanding of the asceticism, especially when we start talking about the Samanera vows and what those might really mean. So, and there's also a lot of just fantasy. People show up at the Zen Center and they have watched Kung Fu, or they saw some movie or some TV show about Zen or Zen monks, and they realize, oh, I want that. I want to live like that. And there's a lot of fantasy as to what that is, and that fantasy brings a lot of misunderstanding. And you also have a lot of the, I call the Zen gamers. And any group where there's a hierarchy is going to always attract the gamer, who is going to see a ladder to climb, and they're going to climb that ladder as high as they can. And this is something that is quite prevalent in sanghas that have a hierarchy, and something that sanghas probably need to readdress at some point. So this is something where I believe that I will be talking more about is the strong sangha and how to create a strong sangha and a strong practice. This is vital to one's spiritual practice, because with a weak practice and a weak understanding and a weak devotion, then the Sangha is going to be weak and vulnerable to a lot of things that can really create chaos and harm to others. And chaos and harm always bring suffering. And that is not what we're about, because the Bodhisattva path is to the elimination of suffering, so that all sentient beings can hear and receive the Dharma. And that's it. All right, well, this is the end of my talk. Definitely want to thank you very much for listening, and I encourage you to remember to like and subscribe.